Welcome back to the Talk Past podcast. I am your host, NC, and here we will be discussing the medieval themed book Redwall, which is about to be an animated series as well. So, again, of course, I'm here with my guest.
It's me, a barrel and a badger, your friendly Red Iron Riot, aka the War Queen, and I'm very excited about this because everyone has that series of books that they probably really enjoyed when they were kids, and for me, it was the Redwall series.
Mm-hmm.
So hearing that it's getting a newer, modern animated series plus a movie is very exciting.
Exactly. It's one of those kind of films or books or stories that were sort of like Fievel Goes West and those old sort of animated kind of not so much anthropomorphized, but those old animal movies where they got like little swords and stuff like Secret and Nim.
Mm-hmm. Like it's definitely it's a genre. It's a good genre.
Yeah. I don't know if Nim took from Redwall or otherwise, but it does remind me of it.
Actually, that's a good question. I think Redwall might have taken from Nim because let's see, Legend of Nim.
Honestly, it's scarily similar.
The Secret of Nim is 1982, so I believe Redwall, 1986. So Redwall probably pulled a little bit from The Secret of Nim.
Yeah, kind of like D&D taking from Lord of the Rings.
Mm-hmm.
So, taking on that, of course, let's delve into what Redwall is. Since you know it best, fill it up.
All right. So, there are two Redwalls. Technically, there is Redwall the novel, and that is the cornerstone of the entire Redwall series, which is a 21 book series focusing on adventures of in Redwall Abbey and Mossflower Woods and the world around it. And as you mentioned earlier, it's mostly about warrior mice and small creatures and woodland creatures fighting and living and all that sort of thing. And Redwall, as I mentioned, Redwall is the first book in the series, so it has a very different. The tone of the world is a little bit different. I believe the author Brian Jacques, and I hope I'm pronouncing that right because he's got. I always, for a while when I was younger, I thought it was always Jacques because Jacques because there's a Q in there, and English is weird. So
it is.
So the titular series, the titular book, Redwall, it is a story of Redwall Abbey and Matthias, a mouse that lives at Redwall Abbey, and the war they have with an evil rat called Clooney the Scourge.
No relation to George Clooney the Scourge. Yeah, it's basically a group of mice that
and
are having to deal
and
with
shrews and otters and squirrels.
Of course, a variety of different animals. Again, a la Secret of Nim or Robin Hood, the old Disney stuff as well.
Mm-hmm.
But mainly a group of gentle mice that are having to deal with cruel and violent rats. So you have that sort of animal dichotomy and situation.
And it also probably could have pulled from Robin Hood because Robin Hood is from 1973. Can you believe that?
Yeah.
Whew.
But of course, continuing, it's medieval themed. Mm-hmm. So everything is situated in some semblance of a medieval period. Probably just some sort of, I don't know if it's a specific period that they took from. It kind of looks, at least from art that I've seen, people depict it in a more generalized 15th century sort of thing.
I'd say more maybe earlier than that because we don't see a lot of armor.
Right.
Especially in this first book, you won't see a lot of armor used, except by Clooney.
Mm-hmm.
But that's a difference because Clooney's a foreign rat who's evil. So,
of course, like all rats, apparently, except for reality. But let's delve into some of the characters then. Obviously, we have a main character in Matthias that we're introduced to pretty immediately in the first chapter. Also, obviously, the first book is the main character. Let's have a quick talk about him.
I didn't reread it. I listened to an audiobook of it because
Mhm.
I don't have a lot of time to read anymore, which is sad.
Yeah.
And so I'm just gonna say rereading it. It's definitely clear that Matthias is your good basic hero archetype.
Mhm.
And that's, I'm gonna say that's not a bad thing. This is technically juvenile fiction.
Yeah.
But he's definitely, he wants to do big things. He wants to, do more than his life, the way his life is headed when we first are introduced to him, where he's not quite a brother in the Order of Redwall yet, but he still aspires to it.
Right.
And it's just kind of it's honestly kind of refreshing to have to go back to it. And he's a very simple character, but he's a good character. He's still a good character.
Reminiscent of someone who's sort of like a knight, medieval knight, coming up into that scenario where you would go from whatever station that he would otherwise have been, and obviously they were trying to put him in the order of the monks, as a peaceful caregiver. But he's more of a warrior. He's more of a knight, so he goes through the motions of becoming that. So that's
he goes through the hero's journey for sure.
Mm-hmm.
The classical hero's journey. You gotta love it.
Yep. And then of course his counterpart, of which he's story-wise should be juxtaposed evenly, is Clooney the Scourge.
Mm-hmm. And this is actually kind of Clooney is part of where we find the difference between Redwall and the later books, because we're introduced to Clooney in the second chapter, surprisingly. Like the nice thing about it is the story gets right to the here's where things are right now, and here's what's coming to mess it up. And Clooney, he's talked about all the places he's been and all the things he's beaten. He's a dock rat. And especially the horse and the cart. It feels like the first idea Jacques had for the Redwall story was that it's this story taking place aside of the world we live in. And okay, I lost track of what I was gonna say, but definitely two foils of definitely do foil each other. You have Matthias, who's coming up to his place in the world, and Clooney, who's there and who's technically kind of there already, but right, he's definitely, Clooney at the point we're introduced to Clooney, he's established leader of his horde of rats, and he's kind of at a point where he's seeking out more challenges, in the term of he's finding looking for a place where he can kind of lord over a little bit. Matthias is clearly he's moving towards that, and especially throughout the book, he's moving towards that high point where Clooney's kind of at.
Right. And of course, from a different perspective, yeah.
Yeah, from good to bad. The one thing I do want to point out before we get too much deeper, the one thing I have an issue with in Redwall is that there's actually it kind of gets moved a little bit in some of the later books, but there's a lot of species determinism.
Yeah.
If you're a mouse or a squirrel or an otter, you're a good beast, and you're not evil. If you're a rat or a stoat or a weasel, you're vermin, and you're probably evil. And while I don't want to say that's a bad thing, coming from a point of where a lot of it feels like a lot of young people start kind of forming their opinions in the period where they're reading books like this, it can kind of be a little, am I a bad person just because I'm this sort of thing?
Yeah, like how you see obviously things like Nim aside, we see things like rats are always bad, snakes are always bad, something like that. Sometimes in a situation a cat is bad.
Yeah.
Like, obviously Nim, but also Lady and the Tramp. these sort of things where they just take this strange sort of stereotype of the animal that is not true, and they just shove that to create a character or a caricature for a character, and then pass that off, and then that's how you end up with things like Jurassic Park and people believing aliens are going to be the way that they are in the movies, and stuff like that, and none of that's true.
Right. Like I can see why, all rats and stoats and weasels are vermin, and it's an easy shorthand. So if somebody's a weasel, if some beast is a weasel in the Redwall books, they're probably a villain. And I get that as a good shorthand for, you don't have to explain that they're bad. You know that they're bad.
I suppose to best describe it in their method is to sort of separate certain things so that it's made simple, that you can understand these species are just, they don't get on well with these ones, and these ones are the ones that are our protagonist. So we're going to paint them from the perspective of negativity simply because of that. As opposed to taking traits from those animals that may actually be real and bad and using those as character traits. Not all of them are bad, but that you just have, some traits that all people and animals have that kind of work against us.
Yeah. So are there any other characters that really jumped out at you that you enjoyed, or?
Not so much. When I listen to anything, on the headphones or whatever, I'm doing something else. So it was very difficult for me to catch details. Because immediately once I'm listening to something, I'm writing or I'm editing or doing something. So nothing really kind of stood out to me. I think if I read it, as in actually grabbed the book and took the 10 hours to read it, I think it would be a much better experience than listening to the audiobook. But especially since it's an audiobook, it's, you don't have that mind's eye.
Right.
It's someone who's reading to you. So you're basically just kind of hearing words. But
well, I do want to say there's another character that I do like, and I'd like to point out as Constance, the Badger Mother of Redwall, and this in the book in the novel, she's not the leader. There is an Abbot Mortimer. Constance isn't the leader, but she's definitely a figure of authority who has experience and who's looked to for leadership and ideas. There's a point, if you recall the point in the book, where her and the unnamed solitary beaver, while the abbey is under siege from Clooney's horde, they're like, she thinks she has a moment and she thinks to herself, if I can kill Clooney, then the rest of the horde will kind of fall apart and take the head off the snake. And there's this moment where she takes the initiative to, I'm going to make a great honking bow to try and shoot Clooney in his war tent from the top of the walls. And it works. She just doesn't get Clooney, which is, I do like that. And this happens a little bit back and forth, that it's never a 100% the good guys always win. There's definitely a struggle. You know what I mean?
As it should when you're telling a story. The main character should always be rolling a stone up a hill in Hades, as it were.
So, I'm trying to think. So some of the characters, there's a bunch, and that's another thing I enjoy about the Redwall series, is that there's just always really interesting characters, and as the books go on, it feels like they do try to the author Jacques does try to push the, like, there's not always the main characters aren't always mice, but they tend to be a lot.
Mice,
but there's a good, I feel like there's attempt to be a good mix, and especially we see this happen in this first book where Constance and badgers in general become, there's always going to be a badger that is going to be like, I don't know if I'm sure there's a trope term for it, but it's not the GOAT, but greatest of all time, but definitely a important character in moving the story along and making things happen, kind of.
Well, yeah. So for that reference, if we want to think, we have, let's go to Lord of the Rings. So you've got Frodo. He's our main character, right? He's technically passed off as the main character. I'd probably say that would be Sam, really. But maybe someone like our Badgers would be Sam or Gandalf.
Gandalf. The Badgers would be, if comparing to Lord of the Rings, the Badgers would be Gandalf. The biggest one is, of course, is that the main part of this world that we see through most of the books is this living a sort of pastoral life in a cloistered society, the Redwall Abbey.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not 100%, similar to what we understand life was for medieval monks and religious folk that lived in these communities, but it's definitely the big kind of guidelines for how Jacques wrote how the goings on in Redwall.
Right. Like for me, it was hard to completely grasp the audio book in terms of a coherent thought. So some of it's very sort of scattered with me, fragmented, if you will. But it definitely comes across as a sort of, I think 13th century would be about right. Sort of your typical 13th century simple living kind of scenario. And you get your knights that are with their lord, traveling, doing battles and trying to expand their land or their wealth, like Clooney.
Mm-hmm.
And you've got your squires or your knight type who's trying to become that on obviously a better version with Matthias.
Mm-hmm.
And then you also have the issue with the clergy. Of course, that was very prominent back then. Not as intense as they are now, but it was definitely a major presence then in a more. That's a rabbit hole of controversy. But yeah, no, turtles. Go ahead.
Turtles.
That's my blank. No comment.
Okay, so yeah, it's definitely you'll read Redwall and parts of other books of the series, and you'll be like, okay, this definitely you'll get that vibe that this is something very medieval. But once you kind of go into it a little more, and especially I feel like some of the later books go away from that because they kind of in the later books we have the world building out from itself instead of whatever was going on in the first novel. But it's very, and I was thinking about this, and I figured you might have noticed this as well. There's actually not a lot of swords.
No.
And I feel that that's actually a pretty good representation. It's like a lot of the fights they're talking. There's archers with bows, and there's a lot of sling use, which I kind of really appreciated. Like, wow, that actually makes a lot of sense.
Although there is a sword MacGuffin in the book.
Oh yeah, there is the sword. The sword is the MacGuffin, but throughout most of it doesn't come into play until like the last 2 to 3 chapters. Well, 5 chapters if you count the snake. Yeah. But most of the fights, there's not. I think they don't really. He doesn't really describe the weapons the rats use. So I'm imagining they have a lot more in the terms of weaponry, but it's spears, it's bows, it's slings and javelins. And I thought that's actually a pretty good representation of, not a lot of people had, swords weren't a regular thing.
Right. And even then they were more defensive weapons. So people had other things already.
And I think I mentioned earlier Constance creating this big honkin' bow. The arrow for it, it was a candle. It was the thing they used to put out candles that had a little brass bell shaped thing on the end, and she turned that into a big honking arrow for it.
Yeah, she had a giant yew crossbow.
Yep. Oh man, I love that. I love that sequence. It's just a nice little. We got a plan. We're gonna do it. And dang.
Which is mood. That's the real world.
Mhm.
Although Clooney had a barbed
He had
tail.
he had the barb thing for his tail, which I love as just I think it gave him a very distinct feel as a villain. It's like he doesn't need a sword. He's got this crazy freaking tail.
The medieval world in general, not everyone had a sword. It's expensive. Usually would have had a staff or a pole arm of sort, and swords were really secondary weapons. So even still, you'd have had something that was your primary, and then you'd use a sword as a defense and really last ditch. So the fact that there's such a wealth of different weapons and means of fighting in the book is interesting. It's different. It's not something we really get in media.
And it will carry it does that idea does carry on through some of the other books, except for when you actually have groups that have the capability to arm themselves with more weapons and armor. At the end of the book, the conclusion of the fight between Matthias and Clooney, he doesn't kill him with the sword straight up.
No.
It's not, this great blow that strikes down the villain. He uses the sword to do it, but it's not the sword that deals that killing blow.
Yeah, because I remember he gets warned regarding the sword. It's not a magical item. It's not some end all be all mystical totem. It's a weapon. It's a bringer of death. It's something that's final. And for Clooney doesn't really care much about death. To him, it's kind of like a trifle, if you will, is how that came across to me. So he deals it, of course, readily, right? He doesn't care. So Clooney, of course, that kind of shows you his character is he's so willing to kill others without issue. And then we've got this other character who has to do it and doesn't want to. And so he has to do it in a way that's different.
Well, I don't think it's a sense of he doesn't want to not kill Clooney. I think at the end
defeat him. We need to defeat him. We want to defeat him.
Right.
But it's a different approach between these two basically same sides of the same coin. Right? You got heads and tails of mouse and rat. One, it has to take the same exact path, the other one, but do it differently. So Clooney obviously is the reckless abandon. He's just going all out. He's been there, he's done that, and he's mentally, I wouldn't say unstable, as most villainous characters are often portrayed. I would instead say that he's numbed to the concept of what he's been through, and thus it's not as big a deal to him to do it as well. Whereas we're taking on the path of Matthias, who is just getting into this. He's seeing it for the first time, and thus it's actually mattering more to him now as he's going through that journey. That once you reach the point of these two characters finally coming to that impasse where one has to go, and they both want to move forward with their journey, whatever it is, but they both can't, and they both have completely different approaches to how they have to deal with each other.
What feels like to me what happened is that Matthias kind of realizes that he cannot outfight Clooney. And so that is what leads to the decision to use the sword to cut down the bell. And honestly, that scene is just always, that's a good scene.
It's a vicarious death.
Yeah. Like, I found that, like, in comparison to the other big death, which is when he kills the snake, the adder Asmodeus.
Yep.
Asmodeus. Which is, I think that was a little much. But with Clooney's death, it feels like a little more, I want to say sensible. I don't think that's quite the word I'm looking for.
It mattered more to the story because he's the main villain.
Right.
It mattered more to the character because he's the main villain, you should say.
Right. Although Asmodeus was still... I really enjoyed how Asmodeus was peppered through the story.
Mm-hmm.
And eventually did, he was always going to be an antagonist, but he's peppered through the story as showing up. And yet when he shows up, he's not automatically the danger, but he's there. And
he's an obstacle. Yeah, he's an obstacle for the main character to tackle.
Oh yeah, but he's
some way to deal with it.
You see those bits of him showing up in the story until it's the confrontation, which I always like as a writing thing because it makes you think of, it kind of expands the story beyond just what's happening to this one character.
I like some characters. Obviously, I'm a Slytherin, so I feel he was kind of done dirty, but it's not my book. And
no.
He played his part as a plot pusher. So
that kind of goes back to my whole, there's a species determinism that is definitely kind of a thing. It's you kind of see it with Captain Snow, the owl, which great little character to pop up near the end there. And he serves a good purpose. So, but it's we're in a world that there are these bigger predator animals, and they don't specifically mention them occasionally. I mean, they do mention it in this book where they are eating these cognizant creatures, these mice and shrews and rats that are, they have a personhood. So it's a little difficult to be like, how do you write this character as anything other than evil because they eat people?
But I mean, that's what the animal is. They have to. They're carnivores. If to do a quick sidetrack, of course, that's tackled better in I was about to say Zootopia, but nope. Beastars. Of course, in Beastars we have herbivores and carnivores forced to live peacefully together. That's how they're raised. That's how they're schooled. And I mean, it makes sense that they're trying to build a cogent society together. Same thing as Zootopia, right? Zootopia, obviously, they go wild, and it's a different aspect from Beastars, but I like the Beastars approach better. In Beastars, these animals have the black market. So, I mean, they're not inherently bad people. It's just that they're carnivores. I mean, they need, for the most part, they need to eat meat in order to survive.
Mm-hmm. I think they kind of I know in Redwall they kind of side that with Gingerveer a little bit, where he mentions eating fish, which makes sense.
Yeah, so I mean, in Beastars, you have the same dynamic of these herbivores and carnivores living together, struggling to live together. None of them are good or bad. They're all just people in society and representations of people in society that are trying to just make their way. It just so happens that one of the dynamics is obviously herbivore, carnivore, and how do you live together when one needs to eat the other in order to survive? So obviously in Beastars, you've got the same thing like Zootopia. Some go wild, as it were, but you've got the black market. But I won't, since you haven't watched it, I won't delve further into that. For things like this, Redwall, thinking of things like Nim and other animal movies like Fievel Goes West and such. You've all these animals of Jungle Book, all these carnivorous animals that are often taken as villainous, with the exception of a couple of them, like Bagheera, which is why I mentioned Jungle Book, Bagheera and Baloo, which obviously are carnivores. Well, bears are omnivorous, but he's that. Well, I don't know what Baloo is. He's gray. I don't. Is he supposed to be like a brown bear, a black bear? There's a difference. Because a brown bear is going to be, a little harder to live with, but a black bear is like a giant cat.
Well, that's also kind of that's also it's pointed out a little bit because I believe in the book it's mentioned a couple times where the rats and other vermin will eat like wood pigeon, and that's like, okay, that's a thing, but also the birds are kind of thinking, I want to say they have a personhood as well. Which is a
Yep.
side note. Some of my favorite voice work in the audiobook has to be the folks who did the sparrows, because they were great.
Yeah, exactly. No, I mean that's basically an idea. I mean, I know we're deep diving this sort of thing, but that's effectively ecological niche. Everybody has a purpose in society. Every animal, if an animal does not have a purpose in the location that it's in, if this doesn't have a reason to be there, it's not going to be there. This is not counting in invasive species. I was actually thinking about this last night, um, in terms of dinosaurs, because I don't want to deep dive dinosaurs, but for animals like what we have here, we have your basic woodland creatures, your basic sort of British forest animals, American northern forest animals. They all have a reason for being there. Otherwise, you remove one and the entire ecosystem crumbles. And that's why you have adaptation and what they call evolution, which is basically the reason for purpose, right? The reason for why, reason for diversity, I call it. So all of these animals are living off of one another because they need each other. I don't think in any way, shape, or form that makes any one animal good or bad, because they all have a reason to be there. But but I think it's kind of strange, but understandable, that you would take certain animals, usually the carnivores, and caricature their behavior. Maybe not so much behavior, but their diet. Like snakes are often considered cold, calculating, um, apathetic, and sure, yeah. I mean, sure, in the sense here that we have Matthias, and of course Clooney and Slagar and them rats and mice. It's going to make sense that a snake is going to be a villain to them because that's a primary food source for them. Or in general, if you see a mouse, if you see a rat, there's going to be a snake. If you see a snake, there's going to be a mouse or rat. Um, Usually the other way around. So I understand that, even though snakes aren't necessarily villainous or out to get you or even any way of that way, shape, or form. You could put a mouse in a snake's cage, and the mouse will kill the snake before the snake even thinks about eating it. Um, and also minimizing that. Here we've got Matthias and Clooney. For some reason, mice are always depicted as more gentle and delicate and kinder in nature than rats. Even though rats are I mean, they're both intelligent, of course, but I mean, not too much different.
I don't think there's anything official, but I would bet you money that there is at least one good fan fiction, at least one, where the villain is a mouse,
For
and
Redwall.
I will eventually find it and read it.
Oh yeah, like fan fiction is a whole other thing.
I would say another thing I wanted to bring up, and I wanted your thoughts on this. So when Clooney first comes to the area of Mossfire where Redwall is, we start seeing a lot of what's the term? Like weird, like this happens a lot in Redwall and in the following books. There's a lot of mystical stuff going on, and it's not straight up magic. It kind of gives you that vibe, the same sense that kind of drove the medieval mysticism, where they, I have the bones of the saints, and I have a relic
Holy
of
Grail
the piece of the true
yeah.
cross, and things like that.
Your typical curses and thoughts of like voodoo and whatever. Yeah, that kind of. I mean, same thing with Nim. That's in there in Nim too for some reason. I don't know, that kind of stuff for me personally, because I just ignore it. It serves whatever purpose in the story. So sometimes it's interesting to see how someone utilizes it, either high fantasy or low fantasy, or trying to make it seem scientific or just part of the world. This one, like I said, I have to read the book because when I listen to it, a lot of things get glossed over.
You get it's a different experience from reading,
and I don't pay as much attention. So I have to read it to really formulate the best opinion on certain characters, scenes, and elements. go there. But yeah, no, in general, anything magic related, I typically will ignore it because it just doesn't interest me.
Well, I want to say it's straight up magic. It's definitely spirits and ghosts, and not straight up magic, more mystic.
An air of mysticism.
That
like
vibe,
your
yeah.
mother warning you about the witches in Puritan America, or
Yeah. And we see it a little bit with Seela the Fox and her son Chicken Hound, where we see this a lot in the story with foxes in general, that they play this part of, soothsayers and healers who use, poultice. The term poultice is used a lot. They use this innate mystic knowledge of healing
tend
sort
to
of
have a
deal.
lot of characterizations shoved on them too. Sometimes it's cunning.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes it's sort of that sort of mystery, mystique, kind of magical element, kind of like in Japan. Sometimes in the furry community, it's something completely different. Nope.
Nope.
We're not deep diving that. But yeah, I don't know. It's so it's sort of applying an overall concept of generalization to a character species. Same thing, I guess, in medieval culture and medieval media. It's just a caricature, like Vikings, or nothing like Vikings in media, but for some reason it's a passed on caricature that somehow vaguely fits, but yet is such a gloss over.
Yeah. So I think that's most of the things that really kind of stick out as being medieval. The food, but I'm not gonna lie, since that's something that you mention a lot. What did you think of the descriptions of the food?
There was not as much food as Game of Thrones. Oh my goodness! I know we talked about that in the Game of Thrones podcast.
Mm-hmm. And going back a little bit, so we were talking about how there's carnivores, and there's the Abbey dwellers live a very pescatarian lifestyle, where the only meat they will eat is fish.
So we need to do an episode of this on this channel in a cinematic way that I would rather do, rather than the historian talking about it manner, but actually us as our characters doing it. The activity, which is, there's actually a Redwall cookbook, and we
there
dress
is
up as the characters, and sometimes in some videos, because I want to do medieval cooking, but present it in a practical setting. So we need to order this book and go through the recipes.
Oh man, it's just it's one of those things that is always going to, when you first talk about Redwall and the Redwall series, one of the first things that is going to eventually come up is the food, because there's a cookbook, and almost every book has just these crazy descriptions of food.
Detail.
I think one of my favorites is the deeper and ever turnip and tater and beetroot
in a lot
pie.
of these sort of medieval stories, from Game of Thrones, Redwall, Lord of the Rings. It's not medieval, but of course, Harry Potter. There's a lot of reference and detail to what the characters are eating, and it almost, I think part of it is, as a society, we're obsessed with food. So it's kind of a way to humanize the characters and to get us into it, make us hungry and palatable for more, or something of that nature. So I think it's a way to sort of smell the world and taste the world, not just read it and get your mind's eye.
Well, also, it just as people, just in life in general, a lot of socializing happens over food, with food involved. So it's very, it's very nice to be. It's like, they're talking about food. They're eating this nice meal together, and it's definitely, like you said, it's very humanizing. It's a good way to kind of vibe with characters. Oh, man. So, what I would, yeah, the first chapter. So, what I would say, one of my favorite things that happens in this book, and it's something that happens through all of the Redwall series that I feel brings a lot to the story, is that there's always some sort of mystery and involving riddles and searching and discovering something that's maybe been forgotten or hidden. And that's a big part of this book and this novel, is that they are trying to find the sword of Martin the Warrior, who is, of course, I don't want to say he's Mouse Jesus, but he's definitely a very important overarching character throughout.
He's
the Redwall books.
Their mystical figure.
He's their big mystical figure.
He's King Arthur.
He's at the and there you go. He's their King Arthur.
Merlin, Gandalf, some sort of figure that they need to reach. That's sort of like a all-encompassing guide, I guess.
And it's it's one of the things that I really enjoyed about the series, is that there's always more to be discovered and more that that leads to the solution to the problem of the novel in question. And especially, it's like the entire thing of the tapestry of Martin is torn, and it reveals a riddle to where that leads to his tomb, where his shield is hidden, and then that leads to where the sword is hidden. And it's one of my favorite parts of the book, of this novel, and one of my favorite parts of most of the novels are
it's kind of like the
riddles and the songs
tissue of the story. It enriches the world.
Yeah,
it
definitely is.
It is supposed to be a romantic story.
And I want to say that's a good thing about the Redwall series, is that a lot of the bonds, they're not specifically romantic. A lot of bonds, they're familial. They're what was the term that I was looking for? Relationships are mostly about family and work. Your friends and your comrades.
Kind of like Secret and Nim. Rounding back to that, Secret and Nim kind of had a close call with that unnecessary romance with Justin and our main character, but it fortunately was evaded at the end of the film.
Right.
So it's good that this doesn't have any of that.
The term I'm looking for is platonic. Is that a lot of relationships, they're platonic, they're familial. It's siblings and families and friends, and I think that's really important for a good. It works really well in a lot of the Redwall books.
If you have a story to tell that has nothing to do with romance, then you should try to avoid it as much as possible, because it just cramming something in there just because doesn't work. You should mainly focus on your story and your characters, and if that's something that helps the character grow and the plot move forward, by all means. But it should.
But just don't put it in there to be like, oh, romance, we need that. Cram it in there.
Don't just cram something in there to especially animals. Why do we need animal romance in a book and movie?
And the second thing is, in Redwall stories, there are a lot of characters that are, what is it? They are unabashedly fat, and it's never portrayed in a bad way, except by villains trying to, say cruel things.
Which is strange, because animals aren't generally like that.
Right.
But usually they really only were able to eat to survive. Kind of like you look at whales, like, oh, that's a fat whale, right? People get referred to like whales, but whales are slim. They're pretty slender animals. They're not what we would consider the human perception of overweight, which is stupid still, because everybody has a body. Everyone has a different body that's perfect to whoever they are, and it really doesn't matter what your weight is. But that's in there. It's a lot. It's kind of, maybe it's referring to having a happier, more calmer life, as opposed to constantly fighting, constantly traveling, constantly having to survive, like Clooney is.
I feel like that's an important thing to note, because there's nothing in the story that it's, we're fat, but it's not an insult. It's not a bad thing. It's we're happy and we're living a good life,
like hobbits.
Right. And I think that's an important thing to be portrayed in a positive light.
Mm-hmm.
And I do have a friend, and we who's also very familiar with Redwall. We've actually been talking about it a little bit because it's like, hey, animated series, heck yeah, vibrate with excitement. And we were talking about what
I've already forgotten where it's going. Netflix or Prime or whatever.
Netflix.
Okay.
But it's important. It's just like, hey, these characters are fat, and it's not a problem, and it's not a bad thing, except when an evil quote unquote character is, trying to be cruel, and that's the world we live in a little bit. But it's also it's nice. I'll just say, it's. I keep finding it's like there's a series and a movie. And that's about it. Yeah, the movie will be based off the first book, while the TV show will tackle the story of Martin the Warrior, which can be interesting. Do you think that I think if it's edited properly, the book can be done as a good movie, because there's definitely a lot of, a little bit that's fill, it feels like sometimes.
It depends. I mean, I think at this point in this time and era, it's a lot better to allow books to be shows rather than movies, because we've noticed that movies and shows, mind you, tend to gloss over the material. However, with a TV show, and I felt, now obviously I read the first Game of Thrones book, so when I watched the first season, it felt like everything was glossed over, right? Like scenes in the book that should have been like a 5-minute scene was like maybe 30 seconds. So we might get something like that here, but I don't know. It's not like a Harry Potter thick book.
Yeah.
So I think if they take care of it, they'll be able to keep everything that makes it what it is and tells the story as it needs to be. And if they do need to get rid of anything, they should only get rid of any fluff.
Yeah.
But that's not always how it goes. So we'll have to see.
Yeah. Like. And this is we talked a little bit about the romance, and I'm hoping that I think it's going to come down to a matter of editing and writing, of how they adapt Redwall itself into a movie. And it's like, please don't make this weird. Please don't make this weird. Fingers crossed. Please don't make this weird.
Yeah, don't furry this.
Don't please. I don't need mouse titties.
No. Like Beastars is a romance, right?
Right.
But it's done appropriately, for the most part. But there's no need for it.
Yeah. So hopefully,
if it's not part of the story, don't put it in. So that has been this episode of the Talk Past podcast, which is definitely, you don't want to say that fast 10 times. But I am NC. This is
the War Queen, aka Red Iron Wyatt, aka War Queen.
Indeed. And we'll talk to you next time.